All right. Good evening, everyone. Hi. I'm Elaine Lin, Collection Manager at AA. A very warm welcome to you all to tonight's talk. This talk is actually part of this initiative called Contagious Cities. It is an international initiative that deals with epidemics, global epidemics, in sponsorship by the Wellcome Trust in the UK. But we're not talking about epidemics today. We actually take a spin on this and think about zines as a contagion. To think about how zines being a medium to circulate all these marginalized voices. I am really excited here, and I heard that my colleagues are saying that there's around like 80 people registered for the talk. And I just want to let you know that you guys are really special because we are at a really epic moment for AA to be collecting and actually launching the new section of zines in the library collection after 19 years. I am also very delighted to be joined by my all-women panel here. So we have a Hong Kong-based art and publishing collective display distributor, Elaine and Ming, next to me. I'm not going to block them because I'm just going to press the PowerPoint for my presentation. And then we also have the three zine librarians from the UK, Holly Callaghan, Loesja Vigour, and also Nicola Cook. They're representing the Wellcome Collection, also the Tate Library zine collection as well. And Holly here actually started, she founded the Stuart Hall Library zine collection, and in 2015 she co-founded also the UK and Ireland Zine Librarian Group. So they actually, all three of them share a really cool professional title, a zine librarian, which is very rare in Hong Kong, I think. And so the UK Zine Librarian Group is also, Nicola and Loesja is also part of. So what brings us six together tonight is, I think I need to give you a bit of background. And to some of you who may not have been to AA on the 11th floor, we started in 2000 as a non-profit and independent organization dedicating to researching, collecting, and circulating the materials around contemporary art in Asia. So we have a free of charge library collection and a research collection that mainly deals with digitized material on primary source material relating to contemporary art in Asia. But the core value of this is really the keyword independence. So such independence actually bring this autonomy for us to be collecting and prioritizing what we want to collect. So from day one, we've been trying to promote the idea that we're not only here to collect the big museum and gallery catalogs. We're here to also collect, or document the materials from the less resourceful. So, such premise is really the core value proposition of AA collection, meaning that we recognize that there is, many of the narratives or many of the stories are actually marginalized, and we want to make these invisible narrative visible. So I think this kind of segue into today's talk, and it really have to bring me back to this time in 2014, which many of us know as the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong. And so back then, for many of us, I think we all know that it's a really monumental and combustive moment in time, and actually still, the impact of it still actually affects it today, and literally today, because we have the sad news that actually came out this afternoon. But then the key point, just to bring it back to zine, is really that we see a lot of artists and cultural practitioners during that time has also responded by participating, obviously, the occupying central movement. They've thereafter trying to archive the memorabilia out of that Umbrella Revolution. They've also mobilizing the community to be producing this work collectively and to basically embrace and memorize the memory of the hardcore village, basically. So we noticed that a lot of these artistic practices are scene making, surprisingly, and this is a DIY self-publishing medium. It conveniently evades the mainstream publishing, and in many ways that's very different from how we usually see the artists practice their work. So it's really different from how we usually see the usual artistic practices, let's say. And so, for example, the AA library, we have a lot of exhibition catalog, all the monographs and all that, and they all talk about the artist's work. But what zine making is really crucial in Umbrella Revolution, and what we see here is that they are not only talking about what they make, but what they want to say. And it becomes really personal in a sense. And so what can we get to us as a visual art archive collect at this point to really reflect this part of art that is kind of outside art history also, bring back to the idea of like, how do we actually make the invisible visible? So we began taking zines produced by local artists as a starting point, and then retrospectively go back to the zines that we actually collected, but then scatter around in different library classification system over the past 19 years. And so here are actually some of the zines that we wanted to highlight for tonight, but actually all the zines, we now have around 200 zines, and they are actually all at the back end of the room. So if you're interested, please feel free to go through them. But I really wanted to make sure that you have an idea what some of these scenes might look like. So I'm going to show you some of the examples here. So this one is this artist Angela Xu. The title is called Guy from Hong Kong Hides 73 iPhones in Juice Box. It's a translated title, so if you see there's an exclamation mark in the original English title. So if, some of you might know Angela's work, and she's normally known as this artist who draws biomedical drawings and also video works. So this, producing such scenes is something that is totally different from her usual artistic practices. And what's important for Angela to be making the zine is that she is aware of, during the Umbrella Revolution, there's a lot of these community, more like aging grassroots community who are more conservative, and they were not aware of the impact of the Umbrella Revolution, or they're resisting to understand, I guess. And so some of these scenes actually deals with a lot of tactics on camping and protests. So if we look inside, so this particular page is actually teaching you how to pee when you protest, when you will have to camp for many days. And so how to actually use the juice box as like a facilitator for you to pee. So this is one of the example for her to softly kind of infiltrating the community and to tell people about what is actually happening. So this is actually produced after, slightly after Umbrella Revolution in 2015. Another great example, and I really love this, is called Counter Hegemony Fist. It's a really direct translation in Chinese, Fa Quan. So it's produced by Lei Zhenfeng and Pang Yanming. And then this is actually produced a little bit earlier than the Umbrella Revolution in 2012. So as we know, the the Wu Tan, some of you might remember, it started in 2009 with a group of artists and cultural practitioners. And they actually ran officially until 2013, I remember, and they then went on for another 2 years. So this scene is actually a series of kung fu movements, but it's really hinting at how do you actually keep your practicing this movement religiously, so that you have enough energy flow to be resisting the master, which is tragically about the land monopoly of Hong Kong. So it has, many tactics inside, but I mean, the funny gesture actually is talk about, oh, you should be, remind yourself to check the receipt, because some supermarkets might like trick you into getting discount, but the discount is actually not there. Well, and then the second movement is reminding people to, try to shop in the independent shops, but not the chain stores. So third example I have here is Feng Fo. It's a Guangzhou publication. It started by a bunch of artists graduated from the Guangzhou Academy of Fine Arts. So it was actually a very interesting origin for this, because I think in 2011 or early 2010s, these artists actually had a failed attempt to exhibit their own work in Guangzhou. So thereafter, they started thinking about like various ways to exhibit their own work. And zine becomes really an outlet for them to think about where can they exhibit works. And it started in 2013, and it's actually still running, becoming this primary site for these artists to be connecting with various generation of artists in Guangzhou, letting them write, letting them also showcase their artwork as commercials, as you would see in like regular magazines. So these zines really, let me just show you one. Yeah, so the picture next to the cover is actually one of the artist's work. So the key point I think here at these fascinating zines that it poses that is some really interesting questions. So, and I think we should always be, keeping this question in mind as the collection develops still. So some of these questions are, why did the artists or cultural practitioners mobilize this specific medium? What is the medium in the context of Asia, which is, a region that I don't think there's much historicization around zines yet. And how the community or the intended audience receive these zines? And by extension to that, are we, people working in the library or people using the library, the intended audience anyway? So it then brings up like some ethical issues of some of these zines, which is really individual or really like personal, and how do we actually think about that in the context of a public library? So the following panel, some of the professionals that we consult and discuss these questions with in the past 3 years or so. And we've given them a bit of a challenge today, because each of them have around 10 to 12 minutes to present their practice and experience around zines. I think before we move on to Holly, I would love to share with you the scope notes that we have for the current zines at AA. So the 3 criteria for us to collect zines right now for the time being is zine created by artists, zines created by art space, and also zine about contemporary art in Asia. So it's really an extension to the overall collection scope in the library collection. And we would love for you to come to the 11th floor to the library and to look at the zine. My partner in crime in this project is Asil at the back there. We would love for you to come and give us feedback and maybe also suggest acquisition titles for us as well. So I would then pass my mic to Holly. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, my name's Holly. I work at Tate Britain as one of the senior liaison librarians, and as Elaine mentioned, I've been working with zine collections for the past 15 years. I'm going to talk about being a librarian in just a minute, but I also want to say that I'm also a zine artist. I've been making zines for the past 20 years. I started in 1999, and I'm not being dramatic or over the top when I say that zines absolutely saved my life. Zines were very much a lifeline for me. They were a physical, tangible presence in my life. They were like a dispatch from out there which came to my letterbox, which said, you're okay, there's more people like you, you're going to be fine. So zines really were massively important to me. Zines connected me with people, with communities, with art, with activism, and they connected me with punk. And I talk about punk because punk is supposed to be this accessible form of music, of politics, a way of being, and punk is the way that I got into zines to begin with. And I'm using this graphic here, which is a very famous graphic from a fanzine called Sideburns by Tony Moon in 1977. And this really is the punk ethic. This is a chord, this is another, this is a third, now go form a band. The idea meaning you don't need any skill, no hierarchies whatsoever, just get involved, everybody is welcome. But as a teenager, I didn't really experience that. Punk for me was aimed more at cis, straight white men. I didn't feel it was accessible to people like me. Zines felt more accessible to me, so I've created my own graphic instead. This is a pen, this is a glue stick, these are scissors, now make a zine. And I'm mentioning all this because zines to me have always felt radical and vital and urgent and political and very much attached to that history of radical self-publishing. They've always felt punk. And I realise that everything I'm now about to say is going to sound very un-punk because I'm a librarian. And I work with zine collections, and I want to talk a little bit about what it means to have these radical DIY publications in large art organisations, both from the perspective of someone who makes zines and someone who is trying desperately to catalogue and collect them. My first experience with zine libraries was when I was 15. This is the first zine I ever made in 1999. I got a letter from the British Library when I was 15, which made me feel very important. British Library are a legal deposit library in London, and they require any published work to be collected, and they have one of the largest zine collections in the world. So I was gobsmacked that the British Library got in touch with me and just thought it was hilarious that they cared about this tatty, photocopied, frivolous piece of crap that I'd made. And it's weird now thinking about the significance of that, because 20 years on, I don't have a copy of the zine anymore. The zine is now missing, but it lives on in the British Library collection. And I think it's really amazing that zines can live on because they are so disposable. They're a low form of art. They're not really counted as valued forms of art because they're so cheap and so disposable. I find it interesting that if I ever want to go see this again, I need to register with the British Library, bring along 2 forms of identification, pre-book an appointment, pre-register, and view this loud, colourful punk zine in a very quiet, respectful, serious study space. And that seems very contradictory to me. But that's what this talk's going to be about, because I'm a zinester and a librarian, and the part of me who makes zines understands explicitly that zines cannot be catalogued and collected outside of the context which they were originally made. But as a librarian, I'm trying my hardest to try and do that. They aren't low priority, they aren't to be discarded, and they have a value beyond maybe what the creator originally intended. Zines document people and communities, especially marginalised people and identities which are often missing from history. And as a zinester, I know this to be true due to my own experiences working with transient queer punk communities. But as librarians, we don't always understand the values of these zines and communities. And a huge part for me of establishing a successful zine collection is forging authentic links with DIY communities rather than serving as a tick box exercise of diversity. So it brings me on to my role as a senior liaison librarian at Tate Britain, where in 2014 I accidentally created a zine collection. I say accidentally because it was always my dream to create a zine collection at Tate. We had feedback at a workshop, and I'm quoting someone here where they said our collections were just dead white men. It's not a discredit to the collections of Tate Library. It's a vitally important collection. It's a national art library available to the public. But it tells a very specific story of British art history and a very specific story of international art history, which is steeped in bias. And in 2014, the library were asked to identify some of the gaps in the collection in a very cheap way and think about ways we could build on that. So zines to me felt like a very natural fit. But unfortunately, working at a large institution, developing a brand new collection from scratch can be quite hierarchical, needs quite a lot of permission. So the way to do that is via stealth. So I found actually a copy of a zine already in our collections, which is this zine here. It's called Future Fantastique by an artist called Jackie Beatty. And this was something which already existed in our collections, but I believed was incorrectly catalogued. This was catalogued instead as an artist book. Jackie Beatty does make artist books, but she identified this as a zine. And I knew this was a zine. I'd read this zine. I had copies of this at home. And when I saw this, I thought, if I can just find a way to prove that if we collect more zines, it will help develop these gaps in the collections, then we can start a zine collection. But first of all, I had to prove that this was a zine and not an artist book. And how do you go about doing something like that? Because in the last 10 years, there has been a real shift in how the term zine is used. It's used interchangeably throughout publishing, and particularly the arts. Zines often used interchangeably to describe things like artist books, to describe small press comics, independent magazines, and photo books. And all of these things are forms of self-publishing. They're all radical for existing outside of traditional capitalist models of publishing, but it doesn't always necessarily make them zines. And annoyingly, the difference between zines and artist books just feels kind of intuitive to me, which doesn't help when you're a librarian and you need to write policy and procedure. You can't just say it's a feeling I have in my stomach whether something is a zine. You need to actually come up with a list of criteria. To me, zines are not for profit. They're cheap, easy to make, cheap to buy, and require absolutely no skill or experience to make. And they have a history of radical political publishing. But does my definition as a zine step match that of Tate's? Well, the good thing is, because I established the zine collection at Tate, I could make that the definition. So the definition we came up with at Tate was this one: zines are self-published documents with a history rooted in DIY values and methods of production, operating outside of traditional publishing models, which is quite open to interpretation. But most importantly, it reminds us of that link between radical and political history. We launched the zine collection in 2015, and this is a zine that I created for that launch. It's a very crudely put together manifesto of what I believed zines were. And most importantly, every single one of these points are contradicted by some of the zines in our collection, because I think the most interesting thing about zines is that they are utterly undefinable anyway. And it is not my place as librarian to tell someone whether their zine is a zine or not a zine. And actually, the only rule of thumb that we have at Tate Library is if an artist regards their work as a zine, then we treat it as a zine. If they regard their work as an artist book, we treat it as an artist book. Going back to why we originally started the zine collection in the first place, it was about identifying some of those gaps, about looking at the existing main collections in the library and trying to find things which may be challenged or were provocative or provided alternative voices, particularly in art history. And so I've selected some of the zines from Tate Collection to talk about. I've also brought them here with me as well, so after the presentation, if you want to come and have a look at them, they'll just be on this bench at the front here. This is a zine called Attics and Islands by an artist, Ellen Welsh. And I've chosen this because it focuses on the queer relationship of the artist Tove Jansson and her partner. Tove Jansson wrote the Moomins books and is an established artist, but often her sexuality, gender identity is erased from any biography about her. We have several exhibition catalogues, monographs and work about Tove in our collection, and none of them mention her relationships or her identity. What this zine does is it explicitly focuses on that relationship. It doesn't put Tove in a box and gives her a label, but it does draw attention to the fact that she had a deep, long-lasting relationship with another woman, and it identifies that as a queer relationship. And there's real power to that, not in terms of expanding the idea of the artist in our collection, but as LGBTQ users coming to our collections, they can identify themselves within art history where perhaps maybe those voices were invisible previously. Another zine is this zine here. It's called Vents by Rudy Lowe. Rudy Lowe is a black, queer, non-binary artist based in the UK. And this zine is very simple, very playful, and just features Venn diagrams, kind of challenging the status quo, challenging cis white men, challenging dominant ideals. A lot of these are very relevant to the art world. And what I really like about this is that there are lots of books in the library collection at Tate which are academic critical theory, which talk about some of these ideas. However, they're very dense. You might need an art degree to read them. They're not accessible. Whereas zines like this are just so playful and so fun and immediately accessible to anybody who wants to see them. And I think that's such an important zine to have in our collection. Similarly, Fear Brown Queers is an ongoing visual essay published in the form of a zine by Joyce Jacob, who is a queer, black, non-binary artist, again based in the UK. This really is an amazing collection of interviews with artists based in the UK, of queer and transgender artists of colour, featuring critiques of the art world. The comments in this are so personal and so raw and funny and interesting, and are voices that are massively missing from Tate Library collection as well as other collections of art history. And one of the things I really love about this zine and about this artist is one of the stipulations they gave when we bought this zine was that they said we don't want this zine to be held behind glass, meaning we don't want this zine to collect dust on a shelf as an art object. We want it to be used, handled, traded, and accessed in a very accessible kind of way, because that's the point of zines. And we have made every effort then to make sure that anytime we have workshops and group visits and displays, this is one of the main zines we always get out, encourage people to touch and handle and interact with. This zine is a zine called Documenta. It's written by a disgruntled former employee of Documenta who draws parallels between the Documenta exhibition festival and the abject poverty of the city in which it's held in. It's a very powerful zine, and one of the things I love about this zine is we collect Documenta exhibition catalogues at Tate, and if you search for Documenta, this now comes up in your search in our catalogue. So you're not only hearing that one voice celebrating this very rich, wonderful exhibition, you're now seeing this voice as well. And that's a really great way for us to include more diversity in quite an authentic way, I think. Going to that idea of authenticity is quite interesting, because what happens is large institutions and art organisations start to see zines as just another form of publishing. And there isn't always a level of authenticity there. This is a fanzine that we have in our collection, which looks at the artist Nikki de Sanval, and it's published by a gallery in Amsterdam, and it takes that format that we've seen from so many fanzines in the 70s, 80s and 90s, but it's sold for quite a large profit in their gallery shop, and that money goes back to the gallery. So the ideas and ethos behind it aren't quite so DIY. There's definitely money being made there, but using that cut and paste collage effect as just a style rather than as a genuine way of communicating. Similarly, this is a zine that was published by Tate in 2009 as part of the triennial exhibition. There was a catalogue that went along with it, but this was also a zine that was published. And it's just quite interesting to see a zine that features the Tate logo and an ISBN that is sold for quite a lot of money. The library and publishing department in Tate is quite separate, so I can't really speak about the ideas that went into making this, but there is just some element of caution when big organisations start to publish zines in quite a DIY way. Which I think brings us on to I want to conclude by talking about the way that we try and engage with DIY communities in zine libraries. I think it's massively important for any organisation, whether DIY or institutionalised, to make sure that there are genuine DIY links with those communities. And so we have a public programme where we attempt to engage with zine makers. We attempt to get out our zines quite a lot from the collections, bring them out into gallery spaces, use them as workshops, and also encourage people to make their own zines and add them to our collections. Zines make up just 0.1% of the overall Tate Library collection, and we have a very small team. So unfortunately, the amount of resources and staff that we have means that our main focus isn't always on zines. But I do think there's a real responsibility for us to collect zines. It's a privilege for organisations like Tate to collect zines, rather than assuming that zinesters should feel privileged to have their zines in our collections. And with that privilege comes a huge amount of responsibility. Thank you very much.
Before we move on, I just want to say that there's seats here, so I see that the people are trying to come in. So if you want to... Thank you.
Hi everyone. I think me and Loesja are here to balance out the panel because we are neither punk nor cool. And I think we're going to make this a little bit corporate, but bear with us. So we are both librarians here to represent the Zine collection, which is at the Wellcome Collection in London. Just to set up what kind of library we are and to give you some context to some of the challenges that we're going to present tonight, I will start by telling you about Wellcome Collection. It's a public museum and library that aims to challenge the way we think and feel about health by connecting science, medicine, life and art. The library, whose history dates back to its founder, Henry Wellcome's original collecting in the late 19th and 20th centuries, builds on this theme through its collection by documenting current activity in medical history and humanities and preserving historic material which dates as far back as the 4th century. The library holds over 2.5 million items in various languages and formats, which include artworks and drawings, rare books, archives and manuscripts, to printed and published books, pamphlets and journals, comics and zines, etc. It wasn't until late 2016 that Wellcome officially started collecting zines. We already had a huge collection of graphic material in the collection. This featured small press comics, graphic novels, DIY newsletters by marginalised groups, personal diaries and sketchbooks and scrapbooks. So collecting zines to us felt like a really natural progression. It meant that we were both complementing these existing collections as well as broadening our own ideas about health and the human condition and how they are represented today. And as a result, we've been able to identify and fill in gaps in our collection and diversify the voices and perspectives of health, both physical and mental, visible and invisible in the collection, by deliberately collecting zines which are known to capture issues and experiences that may often be edited out of mainstream media. We began the collection concentrating our efforts on zines related to mental health and self-care. The first zine into the collection was this little one called And For a Minute There I Lost Myself, which for me is what I'd call a typical zine in terms of format. It's a basic one page, which I would open out, but I've got it. So you can come and have a look later. So it's a basic one page folded into a 6-page booklet. We picked up this zine for its content. It's about declining mental health, and we bought it for about £1, which is about 10 Hong Kong dollars, from a UK-based zine distro. We didn't realise it at that point, but when we later came to catalogue the entire zine collection, it was this little zine that came to shape a lot of our policies around ethics and access because of it. Like this zine and many others, it's just a zine for zine's sake. It's for a reader to enjoy, to empathise, to relate to, and not made with any intention of being put in a library or catalogued in any way. The implication of this for us as librarians is that this zine, like many others, doesn't have any typical information that we would come to expect, such as an author, place of publication, or year. So, fast forward nearly 3 years since its inception, and Wellcome has now around 600 zines in its collection, and it is continually growing. We are relatively unique because we have a subject rather than format focus, which means that we don't discriminate based on what a zine looks like, because the content is the most important factor for us. That being said, the subject of health and the human condition is also very broad, which has resulted in a collection that has zines that include anything from patient experiences of physical and mental health to artist therapy, specific illnesses, medication, body parts, bodily functions, everything, well-being. You can count it's in there. And for a lot of our zines, they fall into the subgenre of perzines, which is literally a personal zine. They are autobiographical, alternative narratives focusing on a human-centered issues, emotions, and experiences. As there was, and arguably still is, a real trend for people talking about and sharing their experiences of health and mental health, finding relevant zines was probably the easiest part of developing a zine collection. Zines have become popular again and are creeping back into the mainstream, which, although is probably not a good thing for the DIY culture, it has helped us as librarians to dig deeper and tap into a huge but deliberately underground and often obscure community of zine makers, zine collections, and zine librarians. This was essential to us, as the nature of the material itself threw up many challenges across acquisitions, cataloguing, preservation and access, particularly regarding ethics. And we relied heavily on talking and meeting with other librarians across the UK, thanks to the group that Holly co-founded, which is the UK and Ireland Zine Librarians Group. We learned very quickly that there is no one way or right way to build a zine collection. And for the most part, zine librarians, either professional or self-defined, are automatically instilling DIY practices to either start zine collections from scratch or to strategically collect zines as part of an already established library and archive. It was reassuring to know that for the most part, collecting comes first and figuring out all the other bits like cataloguing, storage and access, they all come later. Even before making that first purchase, we were often very conscious of the fact that we were collecting from a very particular type of zine, which often contained very sensitive, personal, and often distressing narratives, and putting them in a very particular place, a long-standing medical history research library with limited access, considering location, and we have an age limit too. There is something inherently unauthentic about putting zines in a research or academic environment. In the UK, academic research institutions, such as libraries, have historically been facilities curated by those with privilege. And it broadly subscribes to and supports the status quo that not only marginalise certain voices, but also certain formats. Materials such as zine can be seen as having no formal academic currency or prestige. The way that they are typically created, with DIY immediacy, used as an alternative media and disseminated cheaply and ephemerally, goes against the grain of traditional academic publishing. This feeling of inauthenticity rings further true if the access procedures of an institution restrict zines' usage by securing them out of public reach and in closed storage units, and imposing viewing conditions upon them similar for those for rare or special materials. As we are one such institution at Wellcome, having the privilege of time, money, venue and procedures, we wanted to make sure that we could balance the immediacy of zines and the urgency of collecting them with a chance to be critical and reflective on our current practices. We wanted to legitimise the zines' place on our library shelves by allowing them to take up space. We were particularly interested in the idea that the creator of a zine has full control over their content and distribution, something which poses both an opportunity and a challenge for libraries collecting them.
So we were initially and still are inspired by other libraries, especially those that are considered grassroots or independent, which are often more innovative, do more with less, particularly less money, and their authenticity lies with them being as much a part of the DIY subculture as they are providing a space and a service within that. But we also have to work with what we've got, even if that means compromising on access over preservation. That said, lots of pockets of our collections, particularly in our archives, already represent grassroots and or radical health initiatives. One example is DIY magazines like the Centre Monthly, which is a part of an archive documenting the Peckham experiment. We also have artist books, such as this one by Juliana Leet. And we also have archives and material from art or DIY workshop focus archives, like the Keith Kennedy papers and loads of other stuff as well. We feel these materials are paramount to us being able to balance out the voices in our collections, to enable a holistic view of the history of medicine that researchers can really dig into. But we also looked for inspiration across the continent to the United States, where there is a similar but much bigger network of zine librarians, and who have made huge strides in zine librarianship in terms of becoming experts, providing resources, working across both wealthy institutional zine collections and DIY, or barefoot as they call it, zine libraries. We leaned heavily on the Zine Librarians Code of Ethics to help navigate some of the challenges we mentioned earlier around buying, preserving, and providing access to our zines. And we actually have a few copies of it that you can take away. We'll leave them somewhere at the end. And if you don't get a copy, you can also just Google it and you can download one for free. So definitely do that. For us, ethical acquiring means two things. It means prioritizing paying for zines and going direct to the zine maker or publisher to do this. The way we can also start to build, we can also start to build relationships with DIY and zine communities to let them know that their zine is being collected for a zine collection, and what our library is and represents as well, which we think is important. It's a way of developing a mutual understanding and letting the zine maker know that their work is valued and that their position of zine maker as creator, publisher and distributor is a big part of the way we are representing and providing access to their work. This also includes attending zine fairs, and for us not just London ones, which is a great opportunity to get involved and to show the community that there is a genuine interest and a friendly face behind a usually faceless institutional acquisition. By taking the time to form these relationships with zinesters and distros, we can benefit from their knowledge and networks too. They often suggest material for us to collect or even offer to donate zines from their own collections, which is invaluable due to the limited print runs of many zines. We often find ourselves lusting after long-lost titles. And often it's not evident from just the front cover whether something is appropriate for our collection or not. So this flow of communication is key to finding some great gems that we have overlooked. It also empowers the creator or seller to define and contextualize their zine by their own standards. To us, ethical cataloguing means cataloguing zines with as much description as any other item in the collection, which equalizes discoverability, whilst respecting the zine maker's autonomy and privacy. So if a zine maker has chosen to leave their identity or name off their zine, we don't put that information in the catalogue record, and we won't make assumptions to link works together either. We also include a call out to the zinester, which you can see there, if we haven't already been in contact with them, inviting them to amend the catalogue record as they see fit. They just have to email us. Maintaining these standards is particularly important considering zines often highly personal content, zines that may have been made to be circulated to a small audience but have fallen into the hands of a zine librarian. By being aware of these ethical implications, we hope that we can be open and honest about what we do and why we do it, and build up a trust with the zine community who we want to engage as much as possible with our collection and our collecting methods. Jenna Friedman, a leading zine librarian in the United States, has spoken about the importance of promoting an understanding between zine makers and librarians in Stolen Sharpie Revolution, which we also have a copy of that you can look at. She says, sometimes people get upset when a library, or more likely an archive, wants to know their business before letting someone seize its zines. They, the archive or library, may restrict what writing implements you can use and whether you can photocopy or photograph the zines. They might even make you wear white gloves while reading the zines. Being persnickety doesn't make the library evil. It just means that they are focused on preserving zines for research and as evidence of our lives for people in future centuries. Other libraries may privilege access over preservation, meaning that they don't care as much if a zine gets lost, stolen, or damaged as long as it's used. We tried to sit somewhere in between these two approaches, but we realised that this is a fine line to tread. The most important thing we tried to do for our zines through all of this, though, is to recognise and emphasise that they add value to our collections because of what they are. Our zine collection is valuable because it fills in overlooked thematic gaps and introduces new topics and conversations. It acknowledges marginalised and alternative voices, and it challenges everything mainstream, perspectives, formats, and institutions, including our own. It is also valuable because it enables us to challenge our values and practices, mould our outlook and ethics to fit the kinds of material we want to hold now and in the future. And because of all of these things, it allows us to be creative, innovative, and playful in the ways that we interact with it. And that's it.
Hi, everyone. So we are the Hong Kong representatives tonight. We're Display Distribute, an itinerant research platform. And we're coming, I guess, from a slightly different angle in that we are not archivists and we're not librarians. We are ourselves independent publishers. We've been working on independent publishing projects over the past several years, mostly to do relating to the kind of ebbs and flows of commerce and changes within Hong Kong and Asia and Southeast Asia. We are also engaged in an artist-run distribution platform and experimenting with different ways that zines or artist publications circulate. And last year we were invited by AAA to help them build their collection of zines, and this began our inquiry into something that we're calling the semi-autonomous zine that we're going to talk about tonight. And we have many examples that we've been working with to try to expand this definition, and we're going to try to run through them in 10 minutes. So our research on the semi-autonomous zine grows out of an observation that we've made attending book fairs around the region, that the term zine in recent years has been sort of co-opted to apply to nearly anything that is cute, small, nicely printed and colorful and not entirely mainstream. So we kind of wanted to try to complicate this definition. We found zine to be a very generalizing term and possibly reductive, and this led us to the proposal of the SAZ, as we're going to call it from now on, as a particular object of inquiry with respect to the independent publishing culture and production in this part of the world. And our hope is that by exposing more fluid streams of influence and proposing other possible routes for the formations of zine culture, or so-called zine culture in Asia and Southeast Asia, that we can depart from what has mostly historically been a Western-dominated narrative, and to rethink and refine what zines and independent publishing culture can be. And so what is a semi-autonomous zine? We have some references and key terms that have sort of informed the geographic purview of our inquiry, and we've found helpful to refer to and also generative to push against. So where are we? We're in Hong Kong, which is a special administrative region, which, as you are all probably familiar with, operates under a one country, two systems mandate, which means that it maintains a certain degree of autonomy from the mainland China. And just north of us is a special economic zone, which comprises a bunch of different cities. It's also known as the Pearl River Delta, or the world's factory, because it's where the majority of the world's goods have been produced over the last 20 years. And this is a kind of economic experiment that has had some unexpected effects. The third important reference for us has been a term called the temporary autonomous zone, which was coined by this sort of renegade philosopher Hakim Bey. He defines this, as opposed to the sort of ideological, political, and economic underpinnings of the previous two designations, as he defines it by more of an anarchic impulse. He describes it as a space that eludes formal structures of control, allowing for non-hierarchical social relationships to form and creativity to prosper. And he's referring specifically to pirate communities who, in life at sea, they operate by their own kind of self-organized codes of conduct. So considering this last entity, the TAZ, has led us into a more speculative realm. In playfully conflating these acronyms, bureaucratic, economic, and speculative, our aim is to note the formal and geopolitically boundedness of our inquiry, but also to expand outwards and interrogate these conventions as not limited to any singular place, identity, or subject matter. So for us, the semi-autonomous zine instead nods at historical precedents of print, but then forgoes them in search of possible alternative narratives. This is not with the aim of explicitly opposing a Western genealogy, but rather to allow for a more complicated and more context-focused analysis of the conditions and outputs of zine culture in our region that can have relevance further afield. Reading the SAZ allows us to locate practices of autonomy within entrenched structures of media, and in the process attempts to make sense of the dissonances.
Okay. As Ming said already, yes, we have this dual challenge here of, on one hand, not being archivists or librarians, and actually, therefore, to complicate then this idea of the zine with the so-called SAZ, and then how to do this in 10 minutes is quite challenging, I have to say. But I will reference then very quickly a geographer from Hong Kong named Dang Wing Sing, who writes about the concept of mutual embeddedness. And for us, what we wanted to take from this idea is very much about how movements within zine culture have been something that are much more intricate, much more complex, and relate to different forms of circulation in which zine culture can be analyzed and defined. So not necessarily based on form per se, but about movement. So what we mean by movement then, there are three layers that we were kind of thinking about this. This proposition, one about form, as I say, is that zines can maybe not be so easily defined by how they look like. We cannot look for a particular type of aesthetic that would say, oh, this is a zine or this is not a zine. But let's analyze then instead the sort of socio-political conditions which create then a certain form. And what we are interested in, looking again from our position in the SEZ and the SAR, or our location here in the global south, or not Hong Kong per se, but many countries in the Asia Pacific. I can give the example of the Lathala, which is a concept from a publishing collective called Hardworking Good Looking, based in Manila. And their way of working actually moves beyond a kind of DIY ethos that zines are mostly known for, to thinking about DIWO, do it with others. And this is actually the complication of not necessarily doing it on your own, but using the means of production that are enabled by the situation of cottage industry printing in that region. And so there are very often young people who don't even have access to a printer at home, but they're working with these small shops that enable other kinds of minor economies to occur in this region, and that then actually offer a different aesthetic to the books that they are making. So this is a hardcover book that is also in the AA collection, which is a compilation of zines from many young practitioners in Manila. Another idea related to this is this concept of peri-publishing, which we have extracted from another idea from a anthropologist named Anna Lowenhaupt-Ching, and she talks about peri-capitalist practices. And to kind of translate this into publishing, we're thinking of publishing that works in a more parasitical way. So it's actually forms that are adopted from existing forms or existing sort of channels, like the idea of this publication being made via business cards. So that also then influences not only the aesthetics that it takes, but in the kind of channels, the way that it might be distributed. And then lastly, the concept of shanzhai, which I think most of you guys will be familiar with, the counterfeit good culture, the concept of bootlegs that is very prevalent and active in China, of course. And what we mean by this in terms of publishing is thinking about how ideas of authorship can be much more complicated. It's not simply about one author claiming the particular book they're making, but it's about a kind of accumulated production that happens over time as a way also to subvert the dominant discourse. And the second movement that we're talking about, moving from form, rising this way, looking at form in terms of social movement and networks and communities that are created by this publishing culture. So this is not only about the people and that are involved with making zines and the people who are reading zines, but about, of course, then the knowledge that is being transmitted through this kind of work. On one hand, I think the aspect of this intimate scale that happens with minority or marginalized publics making zines is that the readers very often have a much more engaged relationship to the makers, and the readers are very often becoming producers or authors themselves. This kind of dialogue is much more yes, as I said, engaged than what you would see in mainstream publishing. And it allows a kind of active dialogue. It creates a stronger sense of community than what you would see, of course, with mainstream publishing. The third, sorry, the third one.
So the third type of movement that we were thinking about with the SAZ is about the kind of interplay or the relationship between virtual and physical space. We wanted to collapse the idea or the kind of binary between these two spaces, which has kind of been an ongoing discussion in relation to independent publishing. Like, what is the point of what is the point of physical print when in the age of the internet? But we see them as in conversation with one another, and whereas the web can increase accessibility, a print object can also limit in a productive sort of way, for example, by creating a safe space for certain communities in the limited way that it circulates. So for us, SAZ lies somewhere at the precipice between permanence of books and the ephemerality of disposable print matter and virtual access, and really considers the ways that different media circulate and that impacts the kind of knowledge that's being shared. So we're going to run really quickly through two kind of trajectories that we've been looking at that are specific to this context.
So again, these two trajectories, this being the first one, are trying to look for examples from our own context that would offer another kind of lens with which we can view independent publishing culture. I'm definitely not a manga expert, so forgive me if I mess this one up. But 同人志 or doujinshi or 同人记 is a kind of outcropping derivative from mainstream manga culture that, of course, from Japan, which actually began very early on in the Meiji period, late 19th century. And what I find very interesting about this example is that it stems from actually literature and poetry circles at that time, so text-based. And the term doujinshi, meaning same person periodical, actually emphasizes then the communities that are involved in the making of this kind of work. So it was about groups of students or young people getting together outside of school and outside of their normal institutions in order to share their ideas about literature and society. Over time, then into the 20th century, and maybe also even like punk zines influenced by the photocopy machine, doujinshi eventually got associated more with comics and the manga world, and the kind of communities that have evolved around that are similar to fanzines in the sense that there is a mainstream manga culture, and doujinshi writers were looking in the loopholes to be able to create their kind of offshoots using mainstream characters, but writing their own stories. These are just a couple of examples of how that could be interpreted today. This is a comic series from a young artist in China based in Wuhan, and he's made his series called the How to Use Space series, which involves 5 different zines these two are based on existing comics. On the left, San Mao is a very famous, well-known comic from China from the 1930s, and then of course you know Doraemon. The Lian Huan Hua is a kind of linked serial picture book, also from China, very popular during the Cultural Revolution period. And I wanted to sort of bring that relation, of course, with the way the image is carrying the narrative in this type of production, and how it's also been interpreted also contemporary by artists. On the lower right-hand side, the collective Pollitt sheer form has used the format of the Lian Huan Hua to make their own picture book that documents their activities as an art collective.
What time is that? Another trajectory that we were exploring, I'll explain quickly, is the dazibao, which are the big character posters from the Cultural Revolution in China. These were large-scale civilian created publications, as we're considering them, that were posted in that voiced kind of protests to the government and were posted in public space. We see kind of a contemporary example in the work of Hong Kong artist Jenny Kwan, who creates these really intricate poetry pieces that she posts in public space and also distributes manually, and sometimes also uses to adorn herself during protests. And another example is the Chinese artist Wang Xingsong, who, again, like kind of demonstrative of this interplay between the virtual and the material, has created these posters featuring the most searched questions on the internet in China. And then a last example that we were considering to follow from the Dazibao tradition is the work of this graffiti artist in Thailand, Samir Pirachai. And then to bring it back to show how we believe that the SAZ really have reverberating effects and are relevant in the wider global context, Group Material, which was a artist activist collective in the US in the 80s, also reinterpreted the Dazibao format and used it to express kind of the limitations and taboos surrounding the AIDS crisis in New York in the 80s. Yeah, we're over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for rushing through the provocations. But it's really amazing to hear the various presentations juxtaposing each other, I feel. Just to let you know that the semi-autonomous zine, Shortlist and SAZ, is actually online on Asia Archive's website. So it was actually, as Ming has described, this was one of our process of building the zine collection. We wanted to understand how we can understand zine from the context of Asia. So I feel like hopefully like the presentation just now was this really illustrating, showing really illustrating examples on how these genealogy of zines in Asia is really complicating how we want to collect. And I feel that there are some kind of points that can actually relating back to the library collection, being that I feel like there are a lot of these genealogy and also zine that are actually meant for creating communities that are not necessarily for the library audience. So, and you can see that actually Zines does more for the library in terms of collection development than the library does for the zine in terms of access, in a sense. So I'm really interested to start with the question on access. So how does it like DIY culture and public library or institutional library even can learn from each other in a sense? Because I understand maybe display distribute, like you can describe a little bit more on the way that you provide access to some of the zines that you work with, for some of the examples here, by the light logistics, right? So I would just have you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, and also for the zine librarian to talk a little bit more about the ways that you can ensure that access can still continue after it goes into a library.
Yeah, so we are we run a distribution platform called Light Logistics, which is an artist-run person-to-person couriering system through which we are distributing publications in the region. And I guess relating to the question of access, it is like a one-to-one scale system that sort of contains itself. And so the access is limited to the places that people who are mostly the people that are distributing the zine or the couriering the zines are the makers themselves, and so the system is also producing an encounter between the maker and the buyer of the zine, and so inevitably the context is sort of created in the moment of the exchange. So
can I?
Yeah.
I mentioned it briefly during the talk, but I think this conflation between ideas of who is the reader and who is the maker, and mixing up these roles and allowing them to be translated amidst each other is also very much a part of our project, in that the people who are carrying our books, maybe sometimes it's the maker, maybe it's sometimes a reader who ends up carrying a book to someone else, and that kind of juxtaposition and the conversations that happen because of that encounter are the same kind of like transmission of access on a very, very small scale that we're trying to pursue. And very honestly, I think a big reason that this project began was because we were interested. There's actually from this activist that you mentioned, Lei Junfeng, who had organized a kind of symposium in 2012, I think, was it during the HSB Occupy? Was it 2012 or I think so, 2012, and called the East Asia Multitude. And at that time, they were really trying to look at different kinds of alliances among independent practitioners, artists, and activists between countries in the Asia-Pacific region. And it's very much our notice that there's always a look to the West and not enough dialogue that is happening in this part of the country. And working with the books in this way and trying to distribute among people to people through these countries was a way to sort of facilitate that.
Before maybe you respond to that, there's just one thing that I noticed from the way that you talk about the like logistics and all the circulations, because it seems that the fact that these communities are created like posterior to the zine is made, and all these information is then we'll think about like how do one access that knowledge of the life of the zine, right? So because in the library catalog it's often very flattened, like it's just the information that you can see from the cover or like the content that you can derive. So is there, maybe on that point, is there anything that, you know, if there's any negotiation that you've made? Is there any, it's just a question on how to actually enable the access on that level, if that's even possible.
I made a joke in my presentation about accessing zines through the British Library and having to provide 2 forms of identification and going through all that procedure, and it's exactly the same at Tate. So when we talk in terms of access, it is actually quite strict at Tate, and in terms of how we catalogue things, it is very flat. The way that we catalogue zines is it's just the bare bones of a title, maybe an author, and maybe a few keywords to give you an indication of what's there. But that's not how zines are accessed by people who make zines or people who read zines. It's much more visual, it's much more organic. It's people who trade zines, people who pass them along. They're not meant to be kept pristine and in envelopes in a temperature-controlled store. They're meant to be used at all times. And like the Wellcome Tape prioritises preservation over accessibility for the special collections. But I think there's also barriers with DIY zine libraries as well. So in order to access a DIY zine library, you have to know what a zine is to begin with. And we assume that we all know what zines are because maybe we have connections with counterculture and subcultures. But there's plenty of people that don't know what a zine is, and that's a barrier. Even though they have these free spaces, there's not the same barriers that exist at the library, at Tate or Wellcome. You just have to be in the know and know the right people and know the right cool venue to go to while it's there, because it might close down in 6 months and then open in a squat somewhere else. You have to be in the loop. So there's all this kind of knowledge that is kind of currency in a way. You have to kind of be in the know. So there's barriers at every level. I lost my train of thought there, but just kind of acknowledging that from my point of view as an institution librarian, I'm very aware of the barriers that we put in place, and mentioning the public programme which we use as a way to try and forge some of those links to make them as accessible as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And we experience the same kind of barriers. I think some ways that we try at least to kind of sort of make it a little bit better, we try and work with the zines as much as possible in engagement situations. So we try and not just work with zines that we already have and get them out so people can touch them and have duplicate copies so that if they go missing, then somebody has it in the world and we're okay with that. But we also try and create zines and have creative sessions and invite and zine makers to come along and invite people, obviously, who don't know what zines are as well, but try and create a new community and join zine making communities that already exist, join them to ours and create like this awareness of what they are and create new stuff and new material as well, so that it sort of like transmits back into the world and like keeps multiplying essentially. So yeah, I think that's one way. And then the other thing with the catalogue records, because we have the same access restrictions as Tate, you have to have a library card, you can only request them online and things like that, and it's there's a lot of barriers. We're quite an intimidating library. It's quite academic seeming, even though it's a public library and it's free and anyone can join. It feels like a sort of revered academic highbrow kind of place. We try and bring the zines out of that environment into more public spaces and in more sort of welcoming spaces, so we try and do that, and we try and invite the zine makers to have as much control over the records that represent their zine in the collection as they can. So we ask them, we call out to them to say, email us if you want to take anything down, put anything up, and if they ever want to give us background on their zine or they want to define it by their own words and that like they already have something that they define it as, then we welcome that and we ask them to give us that, and that goes into the catalogue record. So at least, even though it's translated into a library setting, it's translated into a library setting with their language.
And I guess we've touched on this briefly yesterday, but maybe you, one question. So is there anyone that actually ever rejected the zine being catalogued in the public library?
It wasn't a rejection, and I mentioned it just briefly in the talk, but we bought this zine from Jacob V. Joyce, which it was shown on the big screen, and they said yes, you can feature it in the library under the stipulation that it's not held behind glass, that it's used as much as possible. And that's not a request we'd ever had before, but actually it made so much sense that they didn't want this to be seen as like a sacred art object which would be kept away from the public that it's intended to be interacted with. At the moment, we don't have the same procedures that Wellcome do to allow zine makers to kind of pull information off the catalogue if they want. It's something we're hoping to set up this year. But I do understand why a zine maker wouldn't want their zine in our collection. Tate is a problematic institution, and it's a large institution, and DIY zines aren't intended, as you mentioned, for large institutional libraries. That's not what they were meant for. It might not be safe for people to have their zines in our collections. It might just be intended for a very, very small community. So I would fully respect someone's decision to say no. There's a reason why my zines aren't in Tate Library collection, and there's a reason why I say no to my zines being collected by other libraries as well.
We also haven't had anyone directly saying no to having their zine in our library. We made a really deliberate decision from the beginning, to reach out to every person that we purchase a zine from, to tell them, like I said, I think we mentioned it in the presentation, to tell them that we are collecting their zine for our library and what kind of library we are and what kind of conditions that zine would be in. For us, because we are a subject-based library, and it was the subject of zines it's our main priority of why we collect them. It was that was making us feel cautious about putting that people would reject the idea of wanting them put into libraries. So they contain personal information, stories about their medical records, medication they're on, their sexuality, their experiences of just very personal information. Sometimes they put their name on it, sometimes they don't. So they will, as author, choose to anonymize their own zine. So we have to take the responsibility as librarians to go against all of our natural instinct to find out who made the item that's in front of us and to respect the zine. And if it hasn't got a name, we won't put a name in the catalogue. If it is connected to any other work, we won't do that. So I think ensuring that we're honest with a zine maker about what we intend to do with the material helps them feel better, I hope, about putting and having their zine in our library. I think there's only one instance of somebody before we'd even catalogued the collection, we were telling them we will be cataloguing at some point. This means they'll be available on our public catalogue. So if people Google the zine or search for it in our catalogue directly, the information will come up, and they at that point said, could you remove my name from that record? So that was before we'd even catalogued it. So it's making sure that we've got an open form of communication so we can have that dialogue at any point, I think, as well.
I think I'm just aware of the time. I'd like to open it up to the audience if you have any questions. Yes.
Thanks. Thank you to the panel first for a very informative session. I do have a question. I understand from the panel that zines all started small, being independent and mostly inexpensive. Have you ever come across one that has become globally famous? So then do they stop being zines?
I actually brought a zine that, I don't know if it reached here. Yeah, it would help, wouldn't it? I don't have to shout. This zine is quite a problematic zine in our collection. So it's called Do What You Want, and then the subtitle is a zine about mental well-being. This, look how thick it is. Oh, it's got an ISBN on the back. This was huge in the UK. It sold out instantly. It got a lot of media coverage in big newspapers like The Guardian, the BBC, and this isn't, I mean, I can't remember how expensive it was. It wasn't too expensive. It's not the cost of a book. But the idea of calling this a zine and putting it in a zine collection rather than just having it as a monograph with the zine in the title was a decision that we made. Whether it's a good decision or a bad decision, doesn't matter. But we decided that it was part of our policy to basically, if anything called itself a zine, we would try and honour it, even if it was against kind of the way that we work. There are other things like, we have this other one, which is by an organisation. It's just a free kind of leaflet. And we have a leaflet collection at Wellcome, so we could have just put that in the pamphlet collection. But hey, it's got zine on the front, so we called it a zine, and we put it in the zine collection. So I guess the definition swings for us, and as soon as something becomes expensive, we start to question all of our abilities.
But it's also like what Holly said in the zine that she made, laying out the rules. It's like all of those rules for what is and isn't a zine can just be broken at any point, and we kind of have that same ethos that, like, it says it's a zine, so it's a zine, and it goes against all the others, but there we go.
I think sometimes speaking as a zinester rather than a zine librarian, that isn't a zine, but as a zine librarian, that's a zine. I think sometimes people think that zinesters are being quite petty about, that's not a zine and you can't sit with us kind of mentality. And I don't think it is being petty. I think it's about losing that historical context of DIY radical self-publishing. That's so important that when you start using the term zine interchangeably with other forms of publications, that's instantly lost. And I was having a conversation yesterday about a zine fair in the UK, which I'd previously tabled at, suddenly raising their prices up, so it was £60 to table at a zine fair, and it was really only inviting artists to present artist books rather than zines, but still called itself a zine fair because there was some cultural capital to gain from that. It was edgy and it was cool and it was a little bit underground, but not actually helping the community. So it isn't about zinesters being petty about what is or isn't a zine. It really has an impact. And I remember when we first started the zine collection at Tate, I was contacted by a bookseller who sells rare books, who sent me a list of zines for sale, and they were old kind of UK punk zines, including things like Sniffing Glue, which is a very, very famous zine title. It still had on the cover like 50 pence written on the front cover with biro, but it was being sold for £3,000. because it has cultural value now. So it doesn't mean that it's not a zine because it's expensive. It doesn't mean I won't buy it. And it doesn't mean that I hope people out there are photocopying it and giving it away for free in the way that it probably was intended. I don't know of any zine librarian that would pay £3,000 for a zine.
We had a similar thing where we were approached by, it's particularly rare antiquarian or secondhand booksellers that will approach you with a list. They hear that you're collecting zines and they're like, oh my God, you can buy this job lot for £200. And I researched all of the list and they were all either freely available online, were copyleft, or had been digitized by Internet Archive, or you could still buy them for about £2 or £3. So yeah, we stay, as we will say in the Zine Librarians Code of Ethics zine, one of the things that we try and do is prioritize where we're buying things from. So Zine Maker is top, Distro is second, and it goes down, 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 and right at the bottom is your money-grabbing booksellers.
There's a question in the back.
Yep. I think it's more riding on the first question. Is there any concern or contradiction in such as your institution like Tate? It gives certain authority aura to, like, let's say if we collect artwork by the Tate, just like that. So is there any kind of concern or side effect of maybe the zine creator will like have that in mind and create zines in certain ways? And
Yeah.
I also have second question. Sorry. Do you see any? Do you see how the zine will develop in this social network era? Is it going to be still like this tangible thing, or is it going to like evolve?
To answer the first question, yes, I've definitely been approached by zine makers who are excited to have their works included in Tate and will then proclaim to a wider audience that their artwork is in the Tate collections. One of the rules we've had to come up with is when items go into our special collections, we now have to send an email to zine makers saying, if you do publicise this and you're free to publicise it, make sure you're stipulating that it's the Tate Library collections, because that has a very different meaning to Tate collections. It assumes then that we're collecting your artworks. There is a worry that having a zine in the Tate collections validates it. It makes that zine better than another zine which isn't in the collection. That's something that I think all institutional zine libraries are always aware of, because I mentioned that the zine collection is 0.1% of the overall Tate Library collection. We have over 1 million items in the library collection and a very, very small budget to look at zines. So we're not buying zines very regularly. It means a very small amount is being spent on zines. So we can't collect everything in the way that the British Library can collect a wide variety of zines. We have to just say we're being selective to show a representation of zine culture at the moment, but I think it's important for us to work on the way to make sure that we're not saying that these zines are better than other zines and other zines aren't zines. What was the second question? Social media. Yeah, I kind of mentioned this, and I had like a little conversation yesterday about zines, because I've been making zines for 20 years. I remember in the late 90s people saying to me, the internet's here now, zines are dead. We have blogs, this is dead, like stop making zines. And 20 years later, actually zines are more popular than ever. And I don't think it's a conversation of either or, digital or print. I think actually digital has helped zines become as popular as they are. It is now so much easier to find out about zine fairs, zine fests, to get in touch with zine makers. That thing that I said before about having to even know what a zine is in the first place is now so much easier because it's online. Whereas before you had to be in the know and you had to know the right people and know the right shops to go to. So I don't see that disappearing anytime soon. And I think the physical, tangible format, I'm not saying it's better than any other format, but I think there will always be a need for physical, tangible formats.
I think as well, there's also, for a lot of people, we've experienced this working in somewhere that's health focused and medicine focused, that there's a cathartic element to physically making a zine. So physically picking up bits of paper, sticking other bits of paper on it, drawing things with your hands, writing things with your hands. And I think that as a process is something that's very much alive. And I have never made a digital zine or a zine that can be made for a digital audience, but I imagine maybe there's some of that catharsis there as well. But I think that, like Holly said, I definitely agree, they run alongside each other. I don't think one will cancel the other out.
Any other questions?
Hi, I was just wondering, how diverse are the zine librarians in the UK, and how do you see that affect what sort of zines you collect and the access to marginalized communities?
Not very diverse at all. Librarianship in the UK as general, regardless of zine librarianship, isn't very diverse. And there's lots of barriers to that. It's a lot tied up with library qualification in general. It costs a lot of money to train to be a librarian, so there's lots of barriers, and even just becoming a librarian to start off with. So it means you're never going to get a truly diverse librarianship in the UK, which is kind of a current topic in library world at the moment. But there are kind of, all the zine librarians I know are passionate, which isn't the same for other types of librarians that I know. A lot of people end up in libraries because it's a job, whereas zine librarians love zines and tend to be from that world and tend to be from, have connections, very genuine connections with counterculture and subcultures, and are just trying to push that into their job as much as possible, trying to stealthily put those into the libraries that they work in. So there is that connection with DIY cultures, and that does make things slightly more diverse than maybe the mainstream collections that people collect. And one of the things we're hoping to do with we have a biannual meetup. Biannual the right word? Every 2 years? Every 2 years. We have a meetup of the UK and Ireland Zine Libraries group, and one thing that we're trying to do this year is to make it a lot more accessible than it has been, to encourage more diversity in zine librarianship. So we're setting up a travel fund specifically to support marginalised zine librarians, people of colour, LGBT zinesters and zine librarians, and to encourage people to attend that may be priced out of attending other zine library workshops and events.
Did I hear it correctly that you said you personally wouldn't include your own zines in the library? Is it too personal to ask your reasoning, or?
I write under a pseudonym when I make my zines, but I think if you Google it, it's quite easy to trace my zine name to my real name. And my zines out me as a queer person, and they out me as someone with mental health issues. And some of them aren't just relevant for my collection anyway. So the library collection at Tate is very much visual arts focused. So some of my zines, unless you want to read explicit zines about Bruce Springsteen, I mean, who doesn't? But they're not really applicable to the library collection. And then some of the zines that are, it's just because I work there, I just wouldn't feel comfortable having them in the library collection. And I do kind of control where my zines go, and I like the fact that there are zine libraries like the Wellcome and like other DIY libraries that have those conversations with zine artists just to say, are you okay with us collecting those things? Because then you feel like you've got the answer to say, you've got the option to say no if you don't want to.
There's something about zine that is sort of expectation, wanting to know what's the next issue. Can you tell a bit more about the lifeline of zines, where it's maybe certain ones are more anonymous, want to be one-off, and the other ones wants to build up more community, and it builds up. Can you talk a little bit about, based on the collections and based on maybe distributions, because at some point, I also sense that maybe why zines may be more popular, because also it's hard to trace. And if you blog, if you write something very sensitive, people could always find you. And so zine maybe is a very good place to where being anonymous could be an advantage.
I think we tend to collect sort of one-off, so non-series zines, but there are quite a few where it's stressful for us as librarians because we're kind of anticipating a next issue, but due to money or circumstance, it just never happens. So there'll be a zine issue 1 and never again another issue. There's one particular zine that started up, I think, last year or the year before in the UK called Drawn Poorly Zine. And that's a really great initiative where Rose, the person who compiles the zine, calls out. So thanks to social media, which makes it a lot easier, calls out for contributions to that zine. And it's basically themed, and it means that people can address a particular theme. And for the most part, it's about being poorly, believe it or not, but it can touch things on disability, mental health, medication, going to hospital, whatever it may be. And you're absolutely right, people can stay anonymous and it's someone else compiling it, and you can contribute with the lowest risk and the lowest the lowest effort really, and someone else is compiling it. And there is more and more collaboration zines coming out, and I think they seem, for our collection particularly, they're the ones with the longest kind of longevity. They're the ones that commit to series, and people are waiting for the next issue and are willing to kind of back it. So you might find that there's a crowdfunder going for the next issue, and people will fund it through that too. I don't know if someone else wants to add. No. That way? Yeah. You've got a mic.
Just to go back to the example that actually Elaine mentioned very early on, Phong Pho in Guangzhou, I think the work that they do is quite interesting because it's a very lo-fi. I mean, aesthetically, it follows this kind of protocol. So somehow with the zines, it's printed on inkjet printers, staple bound, very cheap, and they have somehow managed to keep it going now for, I think, 4 years. Once a month. It's so much work to produce this little zine that they sell for 1 kwai each. 6 years now. Huh? 6 years now. 6 even now, yeah, but quite a long time. As I understand, the difference, I mean, maybe a lot of one-off zines are probably coming out of these examples of very personal issues, or they're also reactionary, issue-based, or maybe coming out of a personal trauma per se. But with this, I think when you have a sort of longer term, it does inevitably lead to more question of community, also to the kind of infrastructure for the system that they want to set up. And even though it's cheap and it's lo-fi, there is a really interesting thought process, I think, behind that question of sustainability, how they maintain it as a practical enterprise, but also what kinds of people get involved, how they relate it both like in their online presence, what the online presence does, and how it communicates in relation to the print presence, which is of course very small. They're only printing, I think, maximum 100 or 200 of each issue. So very few people actually see the real one, but how they then publish the articles later on the internet, it creates a very interesting kind of dispersion of the community involved in the makers. It's contribution based. So I think there's different focuses then based upon the kind of way that you're thinking through how you're producing the zine.
If I may add to that, Phong Pho is really an interesting case of showcasing how zine representing marginalized community and voices, because in some cases, like zines about mental illness, it's about how those voices has not been represented in, say, the big fat medical books. But then in the case of Phong Pho, is actually artists finding themselves lacking opportunities. So they're using zines as a platform for showcasing it, actually using them as an exhibition space, showcasing their works, showcasing also the writings among the community. And very interestingly, they are able to gather not only, slowly over time, not only the young artists that lack the opportunities, but also the senior artists who just really wanted, the community, to be involved in the community. So in a sense, it's a very different trajectory when thinking about zines, being a representation of marginalized community in the various ways, but it's also showcasing how unconventional zines can be in various for various scenarios. Another question? I think the one last question.
Thanks so much for. Can you hear me? Okay, great. I've heard a lot tonight about content, location, form, and also, I guess, location / I'll call it geography, and also based on the location in which zinesters or people who make the zines self-publish. There's different reasons for that. So maybe this is a question for the librarians or the collections. Have you found, based on maybe some of these geographical locations, or thinking through why the zinesters publish in those areas, or maybe even language from that they publish in, has that shifted the way in which you think through the collection, or maybe even how you categorize or approach, I guess, approach your activities in your collection in general?
It's kind of in 2014 when we established the zine collection, it really was a case of the curators at Tate kind of feeding back to the library saying, we're working much more internationally, your library collections need to support that, because the real strengths of the library collections were British art and some international art, but in a very specific viewpoint of those locations. So the zine collection was one of the very, very small ways we could try and think about filling those gaps. So it was kind of the other way around. We looked at what gaps were in those collections. The artist books collection was mostly British. It was mostly British artist books, and even then a very specific type of British artist book. So the zines really allowed us to develop not just an understanding of British self-publishing, but make it a much more international collection in scope. And that has actually impacted the overall collection development policy that we have in the library. It's now been written into the collection development policy that we collect internationally, and we've identified gaps. We've identified Latin American artist books and zines, African, Eastern European and Asian books are missing from those collections, and that directly impacts the curatorial research groups that work with those areas. So we're now able to say, okay, for this year we can prioritise spending on these areas and prioritise trying to reach out and make links with those areas in a way that previously we were just kind of fumbling around in the dark.
That's really interesting, because for us, our broader collecting remit for the Wellcome Library as a whole has no restrictions geographically, really. Predominantly most of our stuff is either English language or from the UK, but we would collect from everywhere, and we have special collections, like a special Asian collection and things like that. But our zine collection is predominantly, if not entirely, English language. Maybe one or two not English language. So it's international in a sense that there's Canadian zines, US zines, and things like that. And there are zines from, say, Europe, but they're written in English. But we don't really have the research power or the staff power to collect broader than that, although we really, really want to, and it's something that we are going to look at moving forward as well. And I think we've just got to find ways of doing that, and things like coming here as well, where we can collect zines here, and also those relationships that we build with zine makers. The more we build internationally, the more they can tell us zines in foreign language that are relevant to our library. So we might not speak French, German, whatever, but if there are people speaking those other languages that say, hey, this is a zine that is right for your library, then that's great, because we can buy it with our trust that it's relevant.
I think on that note of hoping to encapsulate as much as possible of the marginalized voices and all that, I'll end here, and I welcome you guys to visit our AA library and visit the zine collection that we have just launched. Thank you very much.